Are you working on your author career but struggling to get that first book published? Does the goal of being an author seem too lofty? Or thoughts of having multiple books and making a full-time living are as fantastical as living in Cinderella's castle? Welcome to Discovered Wordsmiths, a podcast where aspiring authors can be heard. Join Stephen Schneider as he finds and talks to authors you may not know, but authors that have gotten their foot on the author career path. Hear what they've done to get there and where they want to go now. Settle back. It's time for a bit of inspiration and advice. Come listen to today's Discovered Wordsmith.
Brought to you by Mind Architecture. Building worlds for your mind.
Today on Discovered Wordsmiths, I have with me Luna. Luna, how you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Good. And I see you've got a Twins jersey on, so I'm going to take a guess where you're from. But could you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and some of the things you like to do besides writing?
Yeah, definitely. I'm an author. I have 3 books out, including The Patient Routine, which I believe we'll talk about today. I'm from the Twin Cities, been in Minnesota my whole life. And outside of writing, obviously I love reading. I love doing art projects. I've been collaging recently. I like to do graphic design. I do a lot of graphic design for my social media and stuff. So I've been getting into that too. I have 2 dogs. I play with them all the time. They take up a lot of time.
Yes.
Otherwise, that's kind of the main thing. That's kind of what I do in my day-to-day.
Nice. What are the dog breeds?
My older dog is a Beagle mix. His name is Yoshi. Great name.
Oh, that's interesting. I had an author on here named Yoshi.
Oh, yeah. Great name. So, and then my younger dog is a Pit Terrier mix. And
nice.
Yeah, she's just a pup. She's just a little over a year old. So,
yeah, we had 2 dogs when my kids were younger, both rescues. Best dogs I've ever owned in my life. One has since passed away, and I miss her greatly. But the other one sitting over there being a scaredy cat is a boxer and maybe English bulldog mix. We're not really completely sure. But yeah, she's a great dog. Anxiety, though, when I leave. So that's a problem.
Yeah, my dogs are, they're very anxious too. And I work from home in my day job, so I'm here all the time. So whenever I leave, they are a mess.
Yeah, same here. What do you do for a day job?
I work in education publishing. Right now it's in like assessment, so like standardized testing as an editor. It's not super fun. My writing is significantly more fun,
right.
But it pays the bills.
Exactly. Yeah. I am into helping kids with writing and showing parents and teachers how teaching kids to write can lead to things they can do in their future, including storytelling in video games.
Yeah.
As an outsider, I'll give it that. I'm not in the system. I see some things that could definitely work better and need improvement with our education system. And the Common Core is not one of the good things.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. Yeah. Luckily, I work in a lot of like accessibility and accommodation areas. So I get to work with a lot of like Braille, large print type of stuff, that kind of stuff. So that's great that I can do something that's very useful, because yes, some of it's quite painful to get through. But
yeah. I was just talking to the Pittsburgh library. They had a fair and they were showing about getting books into Braille, which I would love to do, because I'd love to have my book available to everyone. Even if only one kid ever reads that book in Braille, there's one kid that wouldn't have been able to read that book otherwise.
Totally.
Same with large print, because my son has issues with his eyes and he likes print, but sometimes it gets too small for him. So, I think more authors, especially kids authors, should look into doing some of those alternatives, even though ebooks have helped and audiobooks have helped.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. And accessibility is so, I don't want to say it's like easy, but it's so important, and it's something that we actually should try to do more of. It's easy to put resources into it if you care. So that's what I'll say.
Agreed. I think we're definitely better off than we were 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Definitely.
But there's still some room for improvement. So,
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's actually talk about some of your stuff. So why did you want to start writing?
Yeah, I don't have a super fun like coming to writing moment. I always like to say that I had no clue what I was wanting to do when I went into college. So I was at a community college just trying to get generals done, and I had to take an English class, and it was a fiction writing or screenplay writing, one of the two. And I was like, this is kind of fun. Like the first thing in college that I was like, wow, this is kind of fun. And surprisingly, I was not, a big writing kid when I was in high school or younger than that, or reader. English was not one of my strong subjects. So once I took that class, I was like, oh, I like this. And then I had to take another English course. So I took poetry, which is my main focus.
Oh,
And I was like, oh, I love this. And I feel like I'm okay at this. Like it was a combination of I'm good at this, and it feels good to do it. So after that, I just kept writing, and it's evolved into this, a decade later, and I keep writing primarily just because I have so many, especially with like this book, the patient routine that just came out, and some of my previous books. I feel like there are a lot of like specific things that I want to and need to say. So I think that's why I continue to write, is that maybe one day if I feel like I've gotten to the point where I'm like, I don't have anything else to say, then maybe I'll stop. But for now, I got things to say.
well, I love that it was a discovery process, and you found what felt good and comfortable.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I've heard a lot of people that do I've always wanted to write, and my focus was, always on writing in high school, and, and not everybody comes to it that way. And not everyone, I've talked to people who for years wanted to write a book, and then they retired from their day job and suddenly they had the time to do it. So
Yeah,
I
totally.
think that's an important message for lots of people.
Yeah, and I mean, I sucked at English in high school. I mean, it was not great, and I was not a big reader at all, like I said, and I think I surprised a lot of people when I was like, I'm gonna pursue writing, as a career,
Nice.
and they're like, what? Like, that's not you. Like, well, actually, I think it is. So,
That's awesome. And I'm going to preach for a moment. Something you just said there. You weren't great with English in high school. That is actually like the least of what you need when you write and
yes,
to tell story, because so many people miss that storytelling part. They're so focused on the craft, writing the sentence. And in school, we teach kids spelling and grammar before they've written a single thing. Well, that's like, just in the, nebulous. Why am I learning spelling? Why am I learning grammar? It doesn't mean anything.
yeah,
But I feel if we taught kids writing, just writing stories, telling stories, sitting around in a circle and telling stories before we worked on spelling and grammar, that they would do better with the spelling and grammar because they have something to refer to in their heads. I'm
yeah.
fighting a system. So
Yeah, I definitely feel like there's something to be said about feeling the creativity of kids in writing, like instead of kind of extinguishing it.
and with the software that's still coming, all that spelling and grammar is the least you have to worry about because you click a button and a lot of it gets fixed. So, yeah, all the
Right.
time we spend on that, yes, it's good to know, but it's the same like Civil War. I couldn't tell you all the battles of the Civil War, where they were or when they were. I know they exist and I can look them up. And that's kind of how
Yeah.
most people are with dates and history and stuff. And I think that's kind of where our English is going to get to as far as the rules and the grammar and spelling. Again, my opinion, not shared by everybody. I
Yeah.
think I'm on the leading edge. In 100 years, I'll be revered or something. So,
Yeah.
all
Well,
right.
hey. Yeah.
So let's talk about your book, the important part of what we're discussing. It is called The Patient Routine. Tell us a little bit about it, because it sounded very interesting when I was reading over the blurb.
Yeah. The patient routine follows a character named Ashton. They're a college age, non binary student, and they are suffering from health anxiety, what used to be called hypochondria, and they're having an episode that they can't really shake off, so they decide to check into the emergency room. And in the process of that, the hospital goes under lockdown, and everybody in the hospital is trapped in there until the situation, which, I won't try to spoil too much, gets resolved. So it's a horror mystery thriller. It's all done in verse. Like I said, I studied poetry for my my MFA, my BFA, all of that. So that's kind of the mode that I write in. So it is very playful with the page and formatting and language, but it's definitely a spooky story as well. So it's got a little of everything in there, and it's definitely a journey of the self, finding oneself in the larger mental health sphere, the hospital system, gender, and a ton of other things. But that's kind of the basics of it.
Nice. So it's your Jabberwocky.
Yeah, something
Nice.
like that.
So is it a medical thriller or straight up horror more? What would you say?
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely more like body horror. It leans more towards that. There are definitely some medical aspects, obviously, since it's set in a hospital, but it definitely leans more towards just the horrors of being trapped in your own mind, the horrors of the medical system, but not in the way that I think most people think of like medical thrillers, where the disease or the what's happening is like a really focal point. Like Ashton is the main focus in what's happening with their.
Okay. And can you think of any books, or have you read any books that are similar to this to give people an idea if they're interested?
Yeah, I think when I pitched it originally, it was a mix of The Troop by Nick Cutter, which is a masterful body horror piece of work, and then Eric LaRocca's, gosh, what's the name of that book? It's their first book. There's Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke. It's a queer horror book. Those are kind of my main inspirations. And then there was a bunch of like novels in verse that I read to kind of just see structurally. So that those also took influence. I'm thinking like, what is it? Long Way Down by, Jason Reynolds, I believe his name is. Yeah, Long Way Down. I'm just Googling things. Yeah, so those are kind of the three books that when I was pitching people, those are the ones that came to mind.
Okay, nice. So if someone's read and liked those or a combination of those, they'd probably enjoy your book.
I would definitely say so, yes.
Okay. And what type of feedback are you getting from readers?
Yeah, so far it has been extremely positive. We've gotten, I think right now, there's like over 50 reviews on a bunch of, platforms. Nice. And it's been very positive. A lot of people who are, I think my favorite piece of feedback so far has been, and it's happened 2 or 3 times I've noticed, people have been like, I hated this book the first like few pages or the first like few sections, and by the end of it I loved it, because I think it is one of those things where it is harder to get into because it isn't straight prose. It isn't something that's super easy to get into if you aren't used to reading poetry, if you aren't used to the structure and kind of the norms of poetry, because it definitely leans into those. But I think once you get past the fact that it's poetry and past the fact that it's not just paragraphs, then you can kind of get into the story and actually enjoy it.
So definitely, if somebody's, all the books I'm reading sound alike and they're all the same, blah, 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 I need something a little different to mix it up. That would be a good reason to pick up your book right there.
I would think so.
It's something, yeah, and I know I think that way quite often. I love certain things like Star Trek or what, but if I watch too much Star Trek at one time, I get burnt out and I'm like, oh, I need something different. Right. And then I'll pick up Foundation by Asimov. Way different, but still a little sci-fi, so right. Yeah, definitely for someone looking for that type of thing.
Okay. Yeah, no, definitely. I think, if you're looking for something different, or if you've ever, wanted to see I think it also works in the other way where people, if you're scared of poetry, maybe this could be an easy way to get into it because it has a lot of the elements that regular fiction books have.
Yeah, that's a good point. Poetry with a plot.
Yes, yeah, it's pretty much an epic poem, like the old classics.
The really, really old classics.
The really, really old, the Dante Infernos and the Homers and the Iliads and all that.
The Beowulf.
Yes, so it's definitely along those lines too. I guess
Nice.
maybe I should have pitched that too.
Yeah, well, I guess it all depends on who you're talking to.
Yes, yeah, that's true.
Because I could, if I throw out to certain people, hey, it's a little bit like Beowulf. Oh, heck no, I'm not reading that, But there's other people, if I say, hey, it's a little bit like Beowulf, really? I think I'll check that out. So, yeah, all depends, I guess.
Yeah, totally.
So, Luna, if you had a choice, would you like to turn this into a movie or a TV show?
Oh, geez, I think it's definitely more of a movie. It's a novella, so it's a short little piece. So it goes by quick. Another piece of feedback I've gotten is that it's very, one sitting type of read where you just kind of go through it just in one shot. So I think it would probably fit a movie more. It doesn't. I don't know how you could expand it into a nice like Netflix style show where they really milk it for all it's worth. But I think an hour and 25-minute movie. Oh yeah.
Nice. And horror quite often loses something if you extend it too much. There's very few examples of really good horror TV shows.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. There's few that have done it well, but
that's not an anthology series.
Yes, true. True. I do love like the Haunting on Hill House. That's great.
Yeah, that was exactly what I thought of, one of the few ones. But the Bly Manor wasn't quite as good. Right.
Yes. So, it all, context of the series and source material, that also helps. But
very much. So do you have a website that people can go to and check out all your books?
Yes. Yeah. LunaRayHall.com. That's LunaRayHall.com. And I'm at LunaRayHall on every social media platform there is. Nice.
And we'll put links in the show notes to all that.
Awesome.
So do you have any plans for your next book?
I do have another book coming out in January. It's my second full-length poetry collection. I like to think of it as like a sister project because it is also about health anxiety, but more personal. When I was just talking to a friend about it actually, and I was saying like the poetry book is more about the hopeful aspects of mental health and my personal journey, and the horror book, The Patient Routine, is more about the how can I make this experience as scary as possible to reflect some of the horrors that I've had in my life, but not to push it to the extreme.
Interesting.
So that comes out in January. It's called No Matter the Diagnosis. But I'm constantly writing. So I have another book that I'm pitching right now that is also a horror book that's about analog horror. I don't know if you know what that is. It's like a YouTube-y type thing where it focuses a lot of like on mystery and old. I like to think of it as like old broadcasts that have like secret messages. Okay. That's kind of the easy way to explain it. But I'm also working on my next. I'm doing everything apparently. Yeah, so I'm also working on a full novel length project too. That would be my first novel. So we're seeing how that goes. I have no experience on that, so that's taking it slow, and that's what I'm working on. Nice. And now are you doing all of these in prose, or was this just for the one and you're doing regular type non-prose writing? Yeah, so I have the one that I'm pitching, the analog horror one, is kind of like a mix of both. It uses prose, some poetry, and then it also has like letter writing in it too. It's all over the place. What is it called? Epistolary, right? Yes. That's what that's called. Okay. Yes. Gotta keep my terms straight. But the novel is a novel in verse. That's that's my go-to. I feel like I think in poetry now. I've just been so used to it. So when I'm writing, it comes out like that. I'm not sure. I'm always, someone asked me if I'll write like just a standard fiction book one day in prose, and I was like, I don't know. I don't know if I could. Like, I feel like I'd have to go back to school maybe and learn from fiction writers. Yeah, so a mix of prose and verse.
But also they always tell you, write what you know, and you discovered writing. So if you think and write well in prose, the people you start picking up, kind of like Katamari there, with the rolling ball picking you up, that's what they're going to like and want. It's what makes you stand out too.
Right.
That
totally.
It's that thing that's different about you, but also something that's not so far different that nobody wants it. You know what I'm saying?
Yes,
You
totally.
gotta have that balance.
I get that.
Okay. So what are some of your favorite books and authors that you've read?
Oh, geez.
You mentioned a couple earlier what your book was like, but your personal favorites.
Yeah, so actually, The Troop by Nick Cutter is one of my favorite books ever. It really got me back into horror. I was super lucky to have Nick Cutter blurb my book. That was an amazing experience. But I go back to that book like once a year at least. I have two favorite poetry books that I always recommend, which are Black Aperture by Matt Rasmussen and Blood Dazzler by Patricia Smith. Both are great. Those are my go-tos. I'm also a big fan of, I read a lot of comics, so I read a lot of Saga is my favorite like graphic novel.
My son loves Saga.
Yeah, fantastic. I have the collector's editions behind me. I love that.
I see it right there on the end. Yeah, yes, I recognize the cover.
With a big stack of books in front of it too. So those are those are my go-to. Those poetry books I go back to all the time, and Saga I read a bunch too. But The Troop, I've been a big fan of Queen of Teeth by Haley Piper. She's great. Yeah, so those are my, I guess off the top of my head, those are my favorites.
Okay, great. And where you live, is there a favorite bookstore that you like to go to?
Yeah, I love Moon Palace Books in St. Paul. They're great. I've read for them a couple times, and they're a very queer-friendly, very accessible store. So they have my heart right now.
Nice. Okay, I'll put a link to them in the show notes and a map so people can get to them.
Awesome.
All right. So before we talk some author type things, tell everybody, if someone saw you on the street and said, "Hey, I heard you wrote a book. Why should I get it and read it?" What would you tell them?
I like to think, because it is Pride Month while we're recording, that you should support trans non-binary authors, and especially ones that are writing in verse, because that is a very niche field.
Population of 1 at the moment that I know of.
Yeah, so support experimentation. I'd say that's the biggest thing that I would preach, is that if you like this type of work, or you even have ever thought about it, make sure that you shout it out, because nobody will continue to publish it if it just dwindles. And there are other authors who write horror in verse, who write novels in verse currently, and they're awesome, but they are few and far between.
Yeah, I don't think I could actually name another horror verse book or writer other than what you've talked about off the top of my head.
Yeah, there was, oh my gosh, and now I'm gonna of course blank it. There's this great werewolf one that was in verse, and I'm totally blanking on it. So
we'll look it up and maybe put it in the show notes.
Yes, right. Yeah, I'll send it to you.
So yeah, that'd be perfect. Let me ask you, since you've been writing a couple things now, you're working on a couple things. What are some things you've learned that you're doing different now than you did from the start?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing with my first book, my first book is called Loudest and Startled. It's a poetry book about gun violence and masculinity, family, etc. I think the biggest thing that I learned from that is that now I know more my audience, like what my people who have continually read my books, what they want out of me. I think that's a big thing that I've learned. Another thing is kind of just trusting myself. I think that's a big, just especially with the patient routine, that was a big leap of faith to just be like, I can do this totally different weird thing and make it a success. Otherwise, I mean, if I didn't trust myself, I think I'd just be writing the same book over and over again with different, variations. I would never have jumped into a different genre, a totally different community, really, with the horror as opposed to poetry. So I think those are the two big things that I've learned.
And I love what you said about your audience and what they want, because that sometimes can be a hot topic. You hear right to market quite often in the publishing and writing in, groups and stuff. And a lot of people are like, right to market's bad and blah, blah. But I've discovered people take that saying in two different ways. You can have right to market, which means, I want to write a successful horror book or a successful romance, and I went and studied all the tropes and I threw them all into this book and now I wrote it and it should be successful. You weren't writing what you wanted, you were writing what you thought would sell. But if you have an audience, like you mentioned, and there's certain things they want from your books, there's certain things they want from horror books, you write what they want. You're writing, that is also writing to market, but you're not doing it in that sleazy way. That's what we should all be doing, is writing what our audience wants to read. If not, if we're just writing for ourselves and what we want, then we don't really have a right to complain if nobody else likes it or buys it. But if we understand our audience and we're writing what we want, but what they want to read also, that's a Venn diagram in there. I think that's super important to understand that distinction in a couple different ways of saying right to market.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think I mean, that's I said. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Yeah.
All right, good. Good for me.
We've agreed, yes.
So our discussion, let's talk about this. And I was excited because you're forgive me if I get all the letters wrong. It's changed on me. LGBTQIA+, is that it?
That is, yes. I mean, definitely LGBTQ plus is also acceptable. There's, many acceptable versions.
There's variations, I think.
Yes.
So, which is not even something 10 years ago that was really on anyone's radar or part of the discussion of genres and things. So the first thing I want to ask you is, are you finding it easy or harder to get into? It's hard to tell because you haven't written before, but do you find that saying I'm LGBTQ writer, do you find the difficulties or what's easy about it? What's different, I guess, than someone that's not an LGBT writer that you can tell, that you can see? I know that's a weird question because you haven't been writing for 50 years in multiple genres.
Yeah, I think for me, well, first of all, being queer permeates like all of my writing. Like everything I write is very queer. It's all very part of, I don't think I'll write a book that doesn't have a main character that's
and we mentioned this earlier. They always say, write what you know. Well, there you go, right?
Yeah. So like I said, patient routine, they're very non-binary, and that is essential to the story. The books I'm writing now, they're all trans characters, and that experience is very integral to the story. So I mean, I think that's from my limited experience over the last 10 years, because I started writing when I was not out. So my first book came out right where I was starting to be out. So a lot of those were written very, I would say, shy or frightened of letting on that I was a queer person, letting on that I wasn't, this man that my family and everybody had thought I was. So, I mean, those things are just like constants for me in my writing always now. Like just being queer is part of my work now. And I guess that as opposed to, and I think in both poetry and horror, they're very accepting communities, the author communities, the readers. So, I mean, I haven't had any like pushback. I've definitely had some feedback where people didn't understand the crux of particularly the patient routine, because it is very, queer climax, I would say, where, you know, if you hadn't experienced that and maybe if you weren't paying attention to the whole thing as closely, you might not catch on to everything. But I mean, yeah, I definitely feel, or I mean, right now, I could not pull the two. I couldn't pull writing and queerness apart for me. Like they're just they're integrated now.
Okay.
If that
And
makes any sense.
no, absolutely. And I think, you know, you said about 10 years ago is when you first started. In the last 10 years, the avenues have changed a lot.
Mhm.
That there's more avenues. You mentioned the bookstore near you that's accepting and allows you to come and read, whereas pre-COVID 10 years ago and all that may not have been a possibility. People, you know, oh, that's going to hurt our store, or oh, we don't have a section for that, you know. And I think there's more of that out there, you know, to give you those avenues.
Yeah, I definitely think visibility and celebration of queer work has definitely increased in the last 10 years. Luckily, I live in a state and the Twin Cities metro that is very accepting and very progressive for the most part. So my hope is that 10 years ago it would have been okay too. But yeah, no, I definitely understand what you're saying. And yeah, I think especially for bookstores, I guess there's something to be said about the genre nature of LGBTQ plus.
And I'm so glad you mentioned genre, because I was going to bring that up. But for people who do listen to the podcast regularly and get it, I'm going to just bet there's somebody, oh, I can't believe that he's talking to an LGBTQ writer, and I don't want to listen anymore. Blah. I'm sure there's somebody like that. But
Sure.
But you know what? I like to read horror and I like to read fantasy. I have never taken a horror book and crammed it down somebody's throat and say, you must read horror because I think it's the best. I can't imagine you're going to take your book and shove it down anybody's throat and say, you must read this because I said you should. I don't understand the people that think it's their duty to the world to denounce any genre because they don't like it. And that doesn't even make sense to me.
Yeah, it's a difficult subject for some people, I guess you could say.
That's a very delicate way of putting it.
Without, saying anymore. Yeah, I think, some people are just not open to
right
the width of the human experience.
Well, I'll say for anybody listening, personally, I'm probably not going to go into the store and pick up an LGBT book. That's fine. I'm not your target audience. I go and read other stuff. But if one was on my desk, somebody said, hey, you'd probably enjoy this, I'd at least give it a try. But I wouldn't stop listening to a podcast or something like that because of this one interview or something. I just think people need to move on. Why do you care? If other people are enjoying Luna's books, let them go enjoy it. That's great. They've got something for them to read that they want to read and enjoy.
Yeah, definitely. No, I agree with you.
Well, I'll let you know once this airs if my subscribe rate goes down.
Yeah,
then we'll know who we don't want to talk to.
Yeah, hopefully I don't kill too many of your subscribers.
Well, that's fine. You know what? If people are closed-minded and they want to drop the podcast because I talked to you and you're on here, let them do it. That's fine with me. Keep the rest of them. Now, there is one thing that I know you probably deal with that I deal with. So I write middle grade books, fantasy books.
Yeah.
You write LGBT horror at the moment, we'll say. But here's what bugs me. Middle grade, LGBTQ, those are demographics. Those are not genres. You can't just say, I write middle grade, because a kid that likes Dork Diaries is not necessarily going to like Where the Red Fern Grows. There are two different genres. And what people need to understand is you can have a demographic, but within those demographics, you still have all the same genres. So you write horror, it's in the LGBTQ demographic. I write fantasy in the middle grade demographic, which is way different than an adult fantasy book, So does it, I don't know. Do you run into that or think about it where people just say, oh, he writes LGBTQ? Well, I don't write romance necessarily. I don't write, literary fiction. I write horror. Totally different than just, lumping. Have you ever, thought about that, or is that an issue for you? For me, that's an issue.
Yeah, I think my most straightforward answer is that I don't care. No, I totally understand and appreciate what you're saying, and I think there has been a lot of push for, you know, genrenizing, I guess.
I love that
everything,
word.
everything and anything
Right.
to sell it. I mean, I think that's the biggest thing, is that it's all to sell these things. So you can sell the category, you can sell the author, the book. But definitely when I'm writing, I'm not thinking about it. It's just, it is what it is. And after the fact, I wasn't like going into this and I was like, I want to make a horror piece specifically. It just ended up being that genre because of the content. So I mean, yeah, I definitely don't. For me personally, it's not a big deal or a big thought. That's something for my publisher to deal with.
Got it. That's probably a personal pet peeve of mine.
Sure.
But the other thing is with the LGBTQ is sometimes what does it matter? It doesn't always come into or affect the story much, if at all. For example, The Lord of the Rings. I know there's been a huge argument and debate and whether Gandalf is gay or not, and they should tell us. Or I think Rowling had some of the same issues with some Harry Potter characters, who's gay and who's not. It's like, hold on a second. Harry Potter is basically middle grade. These kids are in school.